Hello, in this video I want to respond to an analysis of Christianity done by my old friend Whatifalthist. And in the beginning I have to say it was a pretty good video, pretty educational, but as the time went on, some bizarre takes appeared in this video. Okay, let us start with the video.
I look around the world and I try to find other people who came to the same conclusion that love is the most important force in the world, and I can't find any. The closest parallel is a subset of Hinduism that holds that love is the way to reach the divine, but due to Hinduism being Hinduism, it was never able to evolve into its own complete ideology. The idea of loving the meek and giving to others was completely alien to the world at the time, as we'll see. The Christians were seen as freaks. Christianity sounds so intuitive in retrospect, but at the time, it was seen as bizarre and disgusting, as we'll investigate in the next segment.
I agree with Whatifalthist that the morality of Jesus of Nazareth was much ahead of his time. But what I also think we should acknowledge is that the teachings of Buddha are also very progressive, and in many aspects they remind me of the famous words of the Jesus of Nazareth, love your enemy. Buddha famously said, even if bandits were to cut off your limbs and left you to die, there is still no point in hating them. To me, this appears to be equally pacifistic and revolutionary, and I don't think that actually Whatifalthist in this aspect gives enough credit to the teachings of Buddha, but he makes an interesting observation, and that is that in many parts of the world, Christianity did abolish slavery. For example, in medieval Europe, slavery was extremely rare, while Buddhism in many parts of the world preserved slavery and the caste system. For example, in Tibet, where Mao Zedong was the guy that abolished slavery. And in Tibet it existed up until the end of the Chinese Civil War. But okay, now let us analyze whether or not Christianity was abolished in Christian Europe because of the doctrines of Jesus of Nazareth, or were there some other economic conditions that led to that? And I happen to believe in the latter proposition. And why is that? Well, first of all, Jesus never explicitly condemned slavery, and slavery still existed in some form in many European countries. For example, the Italian city-states took each other during the war. Their prisoners of war essentially became slaves. In the Merovingian Empire, there was a punishment for wizardry, and if you were proclaimed to be a wizard, you would actually become a slave. And Charlemagne actually even used the Old Testament in order to justify that kind of policy. But what also needs to be said is that, then I have to offer an explanation for why is it that in Christian Europe slavery truly was almost universally abolished during the Middle Ages, at least when you compare it with the Islamic Caliphate, or for example with some other Buddhist empires like the territory of what is today Tibet. Well, an interesting thing happened in the early Middle Ages, in the late phase of the Roman Empire, and that is, as the empire was decaying, an influx of slaves was lured. In order to get new slaves, you have to conquer territory, or you have to have enough money to buy slaves. And what feudal lords realized is that it is actually cheaper to allow slaves to have a certain amount of freedom and turn them into serfs. And why is that? Well, because then the slaves will be motivated to have more children, because they will know that their children will not be slaves. And also slave rebellions, at least in theory, should occur more often than the serf rebellions, because the serfs are, as I already said, treated better. So economic conditions in this case led to the Christian Europe almost universally abolishing slavery in the period of the Middle Ages up until the medieval countries started to colonize the world. That is when slavery re-emerged, and that led me to the conclusion that actually economic conditions here were more important than the ideology of Christianity. And had the Buddhist empires experienced a similar decay that the Roman Empire experienced, I believe that probably we would remember the Buddhist monks as the ones arguing against slavery and prohibiting slavery. But okay, let us continue.
One of the things that I don't hear people often talk about is one of Christianity's biggest appeals was its sexual protections. In many ways, our era is a reaction, indirectly through Christianity, to the toxic masculinity of the Roman era. This was a society where if a man owned female slaves, they were automatically expected to provide him sexual services, and his wife had no place to complain. The price of a cheap whore in the Roman Empire was the same as a loaf of bread. Prostitutes would walk the streets naked, and nude graffiti spattered the walls. One of the things I find ironic is that feminism pushes against Christianity's sexual restrictions, but they don't realize they exist to protect women against powerful men. Christianity's monogamy benefits women who finally get a relationship rather than being Chad's sex slave number 13, and lower-class men who can actually get into a relationship. Sexual restrictions protect women against men who will always use power to get sex when they can. Christianity was very popular among women for this reason. Many of the most important Christians, notably St. Augustine, were converted by their mothers, wives, or sisters.
Okay, yeah, a lot of what we heard is actually true. And what's interesting, Constantine prohibited men from having sex slaves and concubines in the house, which, in my opinion, actually is and was a moral thing to do at the time. And his main purpose in doing this was to make women feel better. Men's wives didn't have to now see the sex slaves that their husband had on the side and his concubines, and it also reduced amount of sex that men had outside of marriage, because a lot of men couldn't keep their sex slaves and concubines away from the house, and it wasn't as practical to have sex with them if you can't keep them in your house. But what's interesting, while this new law was moral and for that time very progressive, it accelerated the demographic fall in the late Roman Empire, because now men had less sex, therefore less children were being born. So if you're very concerned about demographic decline, then this law actually wasn't good. But what's also interesting is that yes, Christianity, like communism back in the early stage of its development, became very popular with women because of this idea of gender equality that can be found in both doctrines. But what's interesting is that in the 15th century, some interpretations of Christianity did become anti-women. So this book Malleus Maleficarum, that came out in the 15th century, in fact in the same year in which America was discovered, two Dominican priests reinterpreted the story of Adam and Eve, in their interpretation, Eve was the evil one. Adam was kind of a victim of Eve deceiving him and provoking him into stealing the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And that was a new interpretation, and for centuries the Christians did not see this story to mean that women were more evil than men. But for that very same reason, because of these two guys and their new interpretation, women were much more likely to get burned as witches than men, because they are, according to these Dominican guys, women are more evil, therefore they are more likely to use evil spells on other people. And that interpretation of Christianity actually is anti-women. But what's interesting, that interpretation developed, roughly speaking, 15 centuries after after Jesus. Okay, but let us continue. Whatifalthist now proceeds to argue that Christianity caused individualism to occur in the West. Okay, I'll first let him make the case and then I will respond.
Christianity in the period after the fall of Rome, which I call the Western Revolution, since it sets up the values the modern West still has today, did a series of social engineering which completely changed the course of history. One of the biggest was the breakup of the clan. Beforehand, for all of history, people lived in tribal clans where they would arrange marriage, people would work with their families, and more. This was just common sense, since people isolated from their families were weak and almost all pre-Christian societies were collectivist. Christianity was never really keen on the family and group identity. There's a theory that Jesus was in fact at odds with his family who didn't support his ministry. The Bible says that one is justified in leaving their family to follow God. On top of this, Jesus was crucified by a colonial state and the social norms of his society. Thus, built into Christianity is a distrust of the clan and group authority. Besides the nobility and the very most rural people started marrying through love rather than arranged marriages. The Catholic Church around 600 banned cousin marriage, which broke down the clan and created individualism. In Italian documents at this point, people stopped being referred to by their clan, but rather as individuals.
Okay. Now, I agree with Whatifalthist that Christianity is definitely one of the factors that led to emergence of individualism in the West, but what you have to realize is that the early Christian thinkers themselves were inspired by both Roman law and Aristotelian virtue ethics. And both Roman law and Aristotelian ethics argue in favor of individualism. And in fact, what I learned in college from a professor that was an expert in Roman law is that individualism in this modern interpretation of the word can for the first time in history be found actually in Roman law, not in Christian law. And this famous Roman lawyer Ulpian, who was not inspired by Christian thought but by Roman pagan tradition, actually famously said that to be just is not to harm any other person and to give to each his own. Now, this might appear as a banal observation, of course, that to each his own needs to be given. But what this meant for Ulpian is that we as individuals have an intrinsic right to property, even if the state refuses to acknowledge this right. And that was a revolutionary assumption. And in a grotesque parody of Roman law, the Nazis had written above their concentration camps to each his own. But Ulpian definitely wouldn't have agreed with the Hitler's application of this great assumption, and that is that all of us, we have an intrinsic right to have our own property. And by the way, Ulpian wasn't influenced by Christian thought in this assumption. And yeah, what I actually need to point out the obvious, and that is, even if this great spirit of individualism can be found in Christianity, for centuries it was suppressed by the feudal system that was justified by the very same Christian doctrine. And I would argue that with the Enlightenment, actually this great spirit of individualism that was in the beginning present actually re-emerged and became what we today think of it. And not to mention that one of the first, in fact the first state in the world that gave absolute freedom of speech to its people was the United States, that also, by the way, happened to be a first secular state in the world. And when I use this term secular, I refer to separation of church and state. And that kind of separation, actually, it still doesn't exist in Great Britain, because the king is also the head of the church. So yeah, I don't think that it is a coincidence that the first secular state was also the first state that gave this great individual right of freedom of speech to its people. But okay, let us continue. Now I want to share with you my take on Whatifalthist's claims about the scientific revolution.
The reason other cultures didn't make science is that they didn't have a worldview that created a context where the assumptions that feed into the creation of modern science exist. One of the assumptions in Christianity is that God's creation is good, followed by a breakthrough in medieval Catholicism that by understanding God's creation, we understand God. The Christian belief in an abstract truth created science. Islam had a similar belief in truth, but they made a turn in the 11th century that the Quran was superior to knowledge of the outside world. Thus, studying the outside world was irrelevant. However, in societies like India, China, or ancient Babylon, the world is inherently subjective and chaotic, and thus trying to develop principles to explain and control it is silly, arrogant, and delusional. The Greeks and Romans had incredibly advanced logical systems, but they never created science given they didn't have Christianity's belief in humility. In the Greek worldview, rationality was superior to actual evidence from the base outside world.
Okay, while this hypothesis isn't maybe that crazy, I definitely heard some other historians claim it, I don't find it believable. I do think that there are some better explanations for why this scientific revolution occurred in the West. Well, the solution given to us by Roberto Lopez, a historian of medieval Europe, is that Europe was the only place in the world where you had 5 or 6, roughly speaking, equally powerful empires. You had the Spanish Empire, the French, the British, the Russian Empire. At the times, the Dutch were a naval superpower, and other powers emerged, such as the Union of Poland and Lithuania. For a time, even the Kingdom of Croatia and Hungary was a very powerful state. But my point is, the only place where you had 5 or 6 equally powerful and, roughly speaking, equally big empires was Europe. Both the Islamic Caliphate, the Chinese Empire, the Aztecs, were surrounded by, generally speaking, by tribes and entities much weaker than them. And the Islamic empires, while they did border with the Europeans, Europeans, because of their wars against each other, were unable to start conquering the Ottoman Empire in a productive way and to go on a counteroffensive, which is why Roberto Lopez argues all these other empires, they didn't need to produce super powerful and destructive weapons. They didn't need to invest so much in the science of ballistics and artillery and naval power, but the European powers, they had to do it, because if they don't do it, then their neighbors will do it. There is that famous speech given to us by a French leftist politician, actually in the 19th century, where he argues, well, if we do not colonize the world, if we do not colonize Africa, then the Germans will do it. Do we want to just let the Germans colonize Africa? That was a preposterous thing to do. While on the other hand, the Chinese, for example, they didn't even know about other powers colonizing the world until it was too late, until that very same powers came to their door and said, you have to buy opium from us. So yeah, I find that explanation to be much more believable. The fact that it was a product of economic conditions and geography. Because then, again, the same question that I asked before, I can ask again. If the conditions for the emergence of science were present in Christianity from the beginning, then why didn't that same scientific revolution happen in the year 500 or in the year 900 or in the year 1011 or in the year 1300? It happened in the 16th century. Why? Because at that point in history we had what Roberto Lopez defines as the states that were precisely the right size. They were big enough not to just be easily conquered, and small enough in order to not be too decentralized, and they had to compete against each other. That to me seems to be the best explanation. And the another explanation is that since Western countries in the Middle Ages, at least in their own states didn't use slaves. That also led to the scientific revolution, because there is that famous quote by the Emperor Vespasian, a military emperor, when he was presented with an steam machine that could do the works of 100 slaves. He allegedly said, well, we don't need this machine, because then what will I do with all of my slaves if we replace them with this machine? While in Europe, both the feudal lords and rich people in the cities, well, for them it wasn't a problem to replace serf labor with machines, because after all, the serfs, they weren't owned in the same way in which slaves were owned. I find these two explanations to have much more sense than this idea that somehow the spirit of scientific revolution was present in Christianity all along, but it needed 1,000 years, actually more than 1,000 years, to re-emerge. Okay, let us continue.
As a final point to throw out, people often use Galileo as an example of how Christianity held back science. The reality is the Catholic Church was the biggest funder of science in that era and is still a massive one today. The Church didn't really care about Galileo's stuff about the sun, but rather he fell afoul of internal politics in the Church. The Church also didn't kill him, which most other similar regimes would have done. Let's compare that to today. If you study race, gender, or genetics, you will face as much, if not more, discrimination than the Church ever doled out. Most of the criticisms people level against Christianity, if you turn them against modern atheist ideologies people propound, make atheism look really bad. Persecuting critics, check. Committing genocide, check. Overly rigid moral codes, check. I mean, Marxists love to criticize Christianity, but Marxism's killed more people than every other ideology in history combined, and easily 4 times as many people as Christianity, in a much shorter time frame.
Okay, I'm afraid to say that this is where the video gets into the ridiculous territory. So we can cherry pick data about each ideology and present it in a very good light. So he mentions Galileo. He wasn't killed by the Church. Isn't that great? Isn't that merciful? What other civilization did this? Well, Giordano Bruno, who also happened to believe that Earth wasn't the center of the universe, was burned by the Church. Now, some argue that he was actually burned because he believed in reincarnation, but many other historians argue that that was just used as an excuse, and that he was really burned for claiming that Earth isn't the center of the universe. Now, if we focus on Giordano Bruno, we actually realize that the Church at times did burn scientists for disagreeing with the doctrines in the Bible, and I could use this same form of cherry picking in order to portray Soviets in a great light. I could say the Soviets, they didn't even kill Solzhenitsyn. They let him go. They let him escape to the United States. Or you can see many Muslim YouTubers say, well, Saladin, he didn't kill the Christian prisoners of war. What a great man, what a merciful civilization. But the reality is, yes, as I already said, you can cherry pick data about each great ideology and about each great civilization in order to portray them better than they were. And I do recognize that most scientists at the time were Christians, but quite ironically, they were also getting killed, and often killed, yes, by the Catholic Church. But the Christian civilization is not the only civilization that had a great paradox at its core. In the same way in which, yes, the Christian scientists claimed that they are doing science precisely because they want to explore God, and then their own church killed them for it. In the same way, Soviets, they actually truly did help to decolonize the world, and without the Soviets, I do think that colonialism would still exist. But that same anti-imperialism, they couldn't apply that ideology to themselves, and they became imperialists towards other communist countries, like for example, like Stalin was towards Yugoslavia and Tito, and like the Soviets were towards China, and like China was towards Vietnam and Cambodia. So yeah, I'm not denying that Christianity at times and the church, they preserved science, but at the same time they killed their own scientists. And yeah, I think this is a good place to end this video. If you like this video, then please like, share and subscribe, and see you in the next video.